Good afternoon all, welcome to today's Wednesday webinar with me, Lorraine from NEP Comms. As ever, this is just a 30-minute session which we are recording, and it will be available on our website later today if you want to watch it back or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. So something a little bit different today, a bit less presentation, a bit more conversation. So please post your questions in the chat so I can put them to my special guest today, who is Inspector Richard Ogden from the Criminal Justice Department at North Yorkshire Police. Welcome, Richard. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So, Richard, we've used these sessions a lot over the past 12 months to talk about using Teams to work with our colleagues and also with our partners. And you're doing both of those things, but you're adding a third group into the mix, that you're also using Teams for engaging with your suspects who are in custody. So I know you're going to talk us through some of the practicalities and the benefits of having done that. But to begin with, just tell us a little bit about the sort of custody landscape in your force area and how you arrange that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in North Yorkshire, we are the largest county in England and Wales, as you may well know. I think you can see on the screen there that whereabouts we are. We have 3 custody suites. We've reduced our custody estate, as have many other forces over recent years. And we have 3 custody suites across the county, one on the coast, on the east coast at Scarborough, which has 17 cells, one at York in the centre of the county, which has 24 cells, and one at Harrogate on the western side, which has 16 cells. And each of those is probably, with our road network and the tourism and the landscape, it can be up to an hour to travel between each one. So we have the geographical challenges that perhaps others don't.
So that prompted you to look at Teams. Were you looking at it before the lockdown, or is this something relatively recent?
Yeah, I mean, as a force, you know, we've got colleagues in our department, our IT departments that have been looking at Teams for quite a long time, but the pandemic clearly forced our hand, as it did with many of our colleagues across the country, in terms of having a look at our business continuity. And very quickly, there was expectations from various partners, understandably, about making us safe and actually being able to operate securely and continue. And using of Teams has been an absolute blessing. I don't know how we'd have got by without it. And certainly, you know, suspect interviews you've touched on, Lorraine, already. We brought them in relatively quickly with using our support with our colleagues in IT. We hardwired in some laptops into our interview rooms, not just in custody, but in our 13 VA rooms across the suite. And we've had a number of, well, I say a number, nearly over 75% is our estimate of interviews have been dealt with remotely, with solicitors joining remotely over this period. Been really well received by solicitors, been well received by suspects, and really well received by officers as well. The technology has been strong, hasn't failed us. We found that actually quite a number of suspects have taken legal advice that perhaps wouldn't in the past, because they know that the legal advice is there at the end of a link. So we've got those facilities there in all of our custody suites, and that has meant that, you know, people haven't had to come into custody. Solicitors were understandably wary initially, and this has meant that they can join and provide that support to their clients remotely, rather than having to come in. Now, clearly they're welcome to come in, and for some of the more serious offences, we have had solicitors come in, and some firms have continued to come in, but the vast majority have been joining remotely, as have interpreters more recently. They've also joined meetings as well. Appropriate adults is one thing that we haven't done via Teams, and we don't want to encourage that. There's a different role for appropriate adults, and they will still join physically. So yeah, remote interviews is one. Superintendent extensions, as it says on there, we've used that. We would have brought that in anyway, but again, COVID has forced our hand a little bit. We have some that are done face-to-face still, but with the geographical challenges in our county, it's a long way there might be one duty superintendent on in our force at any one time, and there might have been no other superintendents they can link into depending on the hours. So travelling across from Scarborough to Harrogate could take anything up to an hour and a half, 2 hours. And actually, if it can be done using the technology, then great. And it's been well received. We've used it for other things as well, Teams, as it says on there, internal meetings, using our custody staff, tapping into them for some quick time meetings during the day, if they have the capacity to join us from the interview room. We've also used it, as elder forces will have done, day-to-day basis. You know, Teams has become part of our lives, hasn't it now? And we've certainly used it for training as well, custody training. We've used it for our annual refresher training, a full day on Teams, which was a bit of a task initially to set up, but it worked really, really well. Officers not having to travel to a central location, not having to get stuck in the traffic getting home, allowing invited guest speakers to join at a time, managing them when you bring them into the call. And actually, in the COVID environment, when there was a lockdown, why would we want to encourage our custody staff from various parts of the county to all come into the same room, whether or not they're wearing masks or not? Why would we want to take that risk? So by doing it on Teams and bringing that training in, it was really, really well received. And we'd look at that again, even after the pandemic.
Okay, so just going back to the actual custody interviews, and to just talk us through the actual equipment setup. Is it just in one room within your custody suite, and so does everybody have to come into that room to use it?
We have it in the vast majority of our interview rooms now. So that otherwise we'd have a queue of people, no doubt, and it's in all the VA rooms as well. And I must make it clear that we don't use the Teams to record the interview. The interview is still recorded by our standard recording devices in the rooms. The use of Teams is just to facilitate the conversation, and we make it absolutely clear to suspects that, you know, that they're going to be joining, the solicitor is going to be joining via Teams. We get their informed consent, and that's a direction from the MPCC, and absolutely rightly so. There have been some concerns around that, about whether, you know, the suspects are getting that support when the solicitor is joining remotely. As I said earlier, we've had a lot of suspects now that are taking legal advice that wouldn't have done before. So I see it from the other side, and I think that they are getting that support. What we do with consultation and disclosure is we have a combination of telephone and Teams. More often than not, we'll use the telephone for disclosure, and solicitors will have consultation over the telephone with their client beforehand. But that's not to say there aren't occasions where they actually do the initial disclosure and the consultation via Teams as well. It varies between stations. Feedback, all positive from what I've heard, you know, and that comes from the suspects themselves that are quite happy to get that early advice. We had people in Scarborough that would wait 2 to 3 hours sometimes to get that legal advice, people travelling great distances to the East Coast to get there, not the best road network at the best of times. And now, actually knowing that they can get somebody online much quicker means that more people are having legal advice. I haven't got a stat for that, but the gut feeling is that, you know, we've increased it dramatically. Feedback from the
just sticking with the suspects for a minute. Do you think in any way that it has affected their behaviour? Do you think not doing it in person has you know, just made them different towards the staff in the custody suite?
Well, I think they realise that we all want to try and get people through the system as quickly as possible. We have 24 hours to use the custody time, and, you know, depending on what the offence is, we want to try and deal with it on that first occasion. But we don't want to keep people in custody for an undue length of time, and waiting for interpreters and waiting for solicitors at times has taken a long time. And the suspect, their risk, as you know, goes up and down throughout their journey in custody. And obviously, the longer they're sat in their cell, they become more upset and volatile. And we have quite a lot of people historically in this force that would have legal advice arranged initially and then decide they don't want it because they don't want to wait any longer. And now it's taken a lot of that anxiety away, and it speeds up the whole process. So it's absolutely generally positive from suspects around that. And as I say,
suspects, sorry to interrupt, but both from the suspects and the solicitors or the interpreters that might be involved, are they all quite comfortable with the tech? I mean, I know a lot of people are using this now, but were there any sort of barriers to begin with around getting them used to doing it this way?
I think a lot of people, it was new for a lot of people, and the best way to get used to it is to try it. And I think now people have become familiar. So I'm not aware of any particular barriers. Yes, there has been a couple of connectivity issues and things at times, but vast majority of occasions, there's no issue. We will send an email invite to that solicitor to make sure that it's just that we're controlling who's coming on that Teams call. So we will send the invite to them, and or to their interpreter, depending on who needs to be on that call. It's all controlled by the officer. The officer is actually in the room with us. I know some forces have got the luxury of having more interview rooms and may have put the officer in another room to even aid social distancing even more. We will put the officer in the room with the suspect. But that's actually less people in the room if somebody's dialing in remotely, and that can only help with obviously the COVID secure aspect of things. And we've put screens in place and other things to try and make that more comfortable for everybody. Yeah.
And have you set up any kind of protocols around, would there be any kind of offences that you wouldn't consider this for, like really serious offences, or maybe offences that, have been high profile?
There's nothing off the table, but I think, as I touched on earlier, I think the more serious offence, you're more likely to get the solicitor wanting to come down and represent their client. But there's nothing off the table, and actually, we'd rather somebody had legal advice than didn't have it at all. So there's nothing off the table. Some solicitor firms have been coming throughout the pandemic. Some solicitor firms have not come in at all. That doesn't mean to say that they can't still provide a valid service and give their client the appropriate legal advice. So yeah, there's no hard and fast rules on it. Okay,
then just one question that we've had come in here. You mentioned about the tech being hardwired in. So is that just still using a laptop, or have you had to bring in more specialist equipment? What are you using?
We've used it as a laptop, and this was always going to be a temporary arrangement. I didn't think none of us probably envisaged that we'd be, here a year on. But, as time goes on, we look to make this more permanent arrangements and using Teams for whatever angle, whether it's linking it to courts and revisiting that angle again, or continuing doing remote interviews. We will enhance our technology and probably have permanent monitors on the wall and have better equipment. But for now, it's just been a laptop. It is hardwired in because probably everybody on this call knows that in custody, the connectivity is a big issue and concern for people, and we've had that before. You can't always rely on the Wi-Fi, so by hardwiring into the custody ones, that's removed that issue straight away, and that was quite painless, really. We got our IT guys and our estate teams in to come and do that, over a day or two initially at the outset, and that was a really good move, because the last thing you want is the connectivity to drop out right in the middle of a suspect interview, and we'd have lost faith with everybody if that had been the case.
Okay, so you've talked a little bit about the feedback from your teams and from the suspects, and you say that generally it's been well received by the defence community. What about the MPCC as a sort of senior policing leadership level? Has anybody expressed any concerns around this? Anybody, been a bit reluctant to move this forward?
Well, I think the important thing is to make sure that suspects are protected and they get the access to free and independent legal advice, and they're not penalised by going down this Teams option. And I think there's a bit of apprehension at first that people might not get the same wraparound service. I'm certainly comfortable in our force that we do give that service. We have to make sure that we inform the suspect and they are fully aware from the outset that the person might be joining remotely, and they are. They are, because they have that conversation over the telephone initially, or they're comfortable with speaking to the solicitor face to face on a Teams call before the actual interview goes live. So people are aware of it. We're not forcing anybody to go on a Teams call, and actually people are desperate to go on the Teams. They think that they're used to it. They love it. The police officers find it great because it's more efficient use of time, and we can get on with investigations and reduce the amount of time people are in custody, and obviously reduce the footfall if we can keep people moving through custody as quickly as possible.
Question here from Anna Benson from Northants, just asking around budget. Was this part of your M365 project budget, or was this the equipment that you've had to install, or what you're planning to install? That's
a good question, and I have got a colleague who's with us on the call who may be able to answer that. But in terms of this, some of the, as we all know, with the pandemic, we did apply for things from central funds as well, and it may be that some of the initial outlay of costs we may have gone back under the standard COVID pandemic budget. But as I said at the start, we were already looking at doing something with Teams, so that will have been incorporated into our local budgets. I don't know if my colleague wants to answer that at a later stage or not, but she's from the technical team.
So I know that we've got Mel on the call as well. Hi Mel.
Hi.
I don't know, you just want to talk cash for just a minute?
Yeah, so within NYP, Teams wasn't on the horizon before COVID hit. So when we had COVID hit the area, we had to make quick decisions in terms of facilitating business in areas such as custody. So there was a specialist budget set up for to allow us to carry on working in the pandemic, and that's where the funding had come. So it's not as part of the project that I'm running within North Yorkshire at the moment.
Okay, lovely. There's a lot of questions coming through, Richard, but I think we might come to those towards the end.
No problem.
So let's just recap then on the benefits, because essentially that's why you've undertaken this work. So you said you think at least 75% of your interviews are being done this way, and so what are the tangible benefits to the force of doing this?
Well, some of the things that I've put on the slides there in terms of certainly the geographical challenges that we have in this force, the travel time savings for solicitors, the time saving for suspects. Actually, there's nothing worse than custody staff having to wait and wait and wait, and the suspect have to wait and wait and wait, and solicitors are busy and they've got to move between custody suites and manage their demand. So this is more efficient. It says on there travel time savings for police as well. Now, we have had situations where we've had somebody in our custody from another force area that might be wanted by us and wanted by another force. Historically, that force might have travelled to our police station to interview that person. We facilitated interviews where we will set up the Teams meeting. We'll have the officer in the room from North Yorkshire Police, but the colleagues from another force will then join and do that interview over Teams, which saves them travelling hundreds of miles or a number of hours. So there's got to be, that's another tangible benefit of this, and something that we could explore more as time goes on. Clearly, it's been great for the COVID secure. If we can reduce any footfall in custody, that was our apprehension to start with. We have small interview rooms in North Yorkshire. You've only got to get an appropriate adult, a couple of officers in there, solicitor, and actually it's very difficult to adhere to social distancing. So if we can reduce, and if we've managed to reduce people coming into the environment, then so much better for it. Benefits around custody staff being involved in meetings and being able to speak to them on duty and join in some of the conversations with management about things that are topical at the moment. They can join via the Teams from that laptop in the room. Not wasting the custody clock, because as we know, the clock will be reducing down all the time, and actually then that has a knock-on effect to then having to go potentially to superintendent's extensions, or even bail people without an interview, as has had to happen a number of times in the past, where we're not in a position to get that done, whether we're waiting for an interpreter to travel 5 or 6 hours from down the south coast for a language that isn't available nearer. They can join on a call. I mean, why wouldn't we use that technology? And quicker outcomes overall. Our average is about 12 hours for people to be in custody in North Yorkshire. If we can reduce that, great. And it's getting the balance between getting people through and out of custody and trying to manage it to a conclusion on the first occasion if we can. But that can only help.
Okay, lovely. Right, I'm going to rattle through a few of these questions before we move on to what you think the future will look like. So Pete, who is speaking to us from Western Australia, but used to work for the Met, lucky Pete, Western Australia. Were there any legislative issues that you had to overcome? Any policies that had to be written down? Did recording the meetings suffice? Did you need to get signatures at a later stage? I guess he's asking, do you need to get a signature that people consent to doing it on a Teams meeting?
Well, we need a signature from the suspect during there's nothing changed in the way we do the interviews. We have machines in our force where we have discs. Some forces do, some forces don't. We get the suspect to sign the recording. We get their signature before they go into interview to understand that they're informed consent, or if we don't get the signature, we at least have a discussion with them beforehand and record that we've had that discussion. So there's nothing that changes that. Obviously, a lot of things in pace, we're governed by pace, and obviously we've had to adapt and be pragmatic during the pandemic. And I think as long as we're all doing things in the right spirit, that's to be encouraged. If we hadn't brought in interviews on Teams, we would have had a real difficulty where quite a lot of people probably wouldn't have been able to get legal advice, because we had quite a number of legal firms, understandably, were very apprehensive about coming anywhere near the custody environment because of this uncertainty around COVID, and people perhaps wrongly assuming that suspects were a greater risk to COVID than anybody else, and that isn't necessarily the case. But had we not had Teams, I think what we'd have done is had people being interviewed potentially without legal advice. People would have just decided not to bother because they didn't want to wait too long. So I think it's all positive around that. As I said, we don't record the interview via Teams, we record it on our traditional recording devices as we are at the moment. Hopefully that's answered Pete's questions, but we had various guidance and policies that we put in place around COVID. You know, certainly when we used links to courts, which we haven't done on Teams, and we'll come to, we're coming to that for the future. I think there's an appetite from some to revisit the courts and the remand courts, notwithstanding the challenges about risk and maintaining risk and staffing video courts. We did it from April to January. We put over 1,000 people through the remand courts, and it was a challenge in terms of the practicalities, but from the technology point of view, worked absolutely perfectly. So we think that will come back on the agenda again at a later date. A force like ours, Lorraine, you can imagine, remote areas, we could get people into court on a Saturday morning that historically we would never have managed to get there physically, and we'd have to keep them all weekend. So if we could put somebody through a link late in the day or on a Saturday morning, actually there are benefits, notwithstanding some challenges on that as well.
Absolutely. Right, moving on to the next question, a very practical one here. Do officers log on to their Teams account, or do you have a generic log on, as otherwise there would need to be multiple users on the set up on the same laptop?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, they're all generic logins for the laptop, so each one's got its own login across the force in the VA rooms and the custody rooms. So it's not individual officers logging on with their own Teams applications. Each laptop has got its own password and it's got its own email address. So it's virtual court. It will be interview room 1, or when we had the virtual courts, virtual court 1, and that's where the email's coming from, not from an officer directly.
Okay, there's two kind of linked questions here. How do you deal with mid-interview consultations? And then the second question is, how do you protect against, excuse me, detainees having access to a police laptop and using Teams for a private consultation with a solicitor without police present? But you mentioned that you always have an officer in the room.
No, both good questions. I'll do the second one first. So yeah, we're very mindful about the risk. We're dealing with some people at high risk. We risk assess everything. We're not going to leave somebody in the room alone with a laptop who's likely to smash it up. We've had one incident when we had our virtual court process where somebody damaged a laptop, but 1,000 people put through and very few issues. So it's not always normal practice to leave somebody in the room with the laptop to have that consultation. As I said, our default position is to use the phone for consultation, but we risk assess it, and if we're comfortable with that person, it may well be that they can do it. The officer will not be in the room absolutely for any consultation. They will be outside of the room within close distance. We have CCTV monitoring the interview rooms. Clearly the audio is not turned on, it's just visual. So if we have any doubt, we can see the room and we can see somebody in that room having that conversation, and if there was any risk, we would obviously go into the room. In terms of if there's a consultation required during the interview, we just do what we do with anything else. We just pause that. We could stop the Teams call at any stage. We'd stop the interview, and we'd allow that consultation to take place. And whether they had to continue to have that consultation on the Teams call, the officer could leave the room, or they could go onto a telephone conversation. There's no difference to what we do in normal practice.
Okay, Smashing, we'll have to rattle through these pretty quickly. Have you thought about using Teams with regard to witnesses?
Witnesses for court?
Take witness statements.
Yeah, it's something that, again, it could have put it on this future slide. I mean, I'm obviously just talking custody today, but there's no reason why you couldn't speak to witnesses about that. We do telephone witness statements. We don't use them as much as we perhaps should, and actually there's a time and a place for doing telephone witness statements for straightforward stuff. There's no reason why you couldn't do it on Teams, and it'd be far more personable. So yes, I see potential with that. As we've got on the futures, we've got inspector reviews up there as well with a picture that looks like Columbo on there. Sorry. We've got inspector reviews is something that is potential for the future. We have a number of, obviously, with it being remote force, some of our inspectors struggle to get to the custody suite to do the reviews, and actually we absolutely want them there for adults, vulnerable adults and children. But even then, there are occasions where we can't always have a face-to-face, so we do it via the telephone. That's always been our default position. There is an opportunity with Teams to do it via that. It's far more interactive. It is more difficult practically because you'd have to take somebody out the room, out the cell, and take them to another room. So obviously there's considerations around that, and we haven't done that yet, but it's something for the future to people to think of, where there's capacity. I think the difficulty is once you make a decision to go down and use inspector reviews face to face, you need to do all of them that way, and you'd have to remove that from telephone ones if you follow in the legal advice on in Pace Code E, Pace Code C, sorry. Greater efficiency for matters involving other forces, I've touched on that already, and potential use of prison links rather than bringing people into prison or us going to prisons. That again is just a consideration going forward of how we can enhance things. And the medical support is for we have embedded custody healthcare. We have 8 healthcare professionals in our custody suites 24/7, but they do need to get advice from doctors and from colleagues, and there's nothing stopping them using Teams, and they're beginning to use Teams now for consultations between themselves as medical professionals. And there's the potential then moving forward to have the suspect in the medical room and having a conversation with a healthcare professional in the room, but also with another expert from there, or from mental health experts and things like that, who may be able to assist with that. So there's all sorts of potential going forward.
Lovely. So going back to the questions, are there any pace implications? I guess that's what we've talked about, the time saving.
Yeah, you've got to make sure we're compliant with PACE, and obviously we'll be guided by what comes out from the NPCC. We're certainly not going to stand out there and do something, put our head above the parapet and do something that's not legally supported. We await further NPCC guidance on remote interviews. There may well be a change in strategy around that. I think it'd be a real shame to remove it altogether when the pandemic is over, and we're coming to that recovery stage now, thankfully, where we're beginning to think and look at our practices. But I think there's got to be still got to be something going forward where there's use of that, and I imagine the defence community across the country will actually be disappointed if we move away from this, as they have been with the courts. But that's a conversation to be had, and we'll be guided by the NPCC. Okay, and someone's asking, do you have any guidance or policy documents that you could share? I'm sure we've got certain things somewhere. We've got various things about how we use it. I mean, if it's practical ways of how we do it, I'm sure we can look to share some of those. We haven't got something for every single example, but we'll have a look at what we've got, and if we think there's something relevant that we can share, I'm happy to do so. Okay, that was an anonymous question, but if you're still with us, please put your or send your details to the NEP, and then we'll connect you with Richard. Someone asking, Dean, that he's asking about interviewing suspects who are in prison, for example, and you've touched on that. Have you actually done it yet, or is that just something? I'm not aware if we have. We may have done. I mean, people historically go at the prison, they take recording devices, and there's sometimes you want to actually see the person physically. Of course you do, but we also, you know, we bring people into custody and sometimes bring them out of prison just to interview them and then take them back. You know, prisons are using live links to courts and have done for a significant period of time. So I imagine that it's been used. I can't say for sure it has, but I think as long as you consider what you've got in front of you, the circumstances, the person at the other end, and if it works for you and it works for them, then why not? Okay, so for superintendent extensions or inspector PACE reviews, have you looked at having the technology in a secure housing in the cells? No, not yet. And that's something else to consider, because there'll be forces there that would, absolutely look at that and actually have the person doesn't need to leave the cell. That relies on the changes to estate. We've got quite an ageing estate in North Yorkshire, but if we were to build new custody facilities, which is something we'll always consider, then that's the kind of thing to consider going forward. So you can leave the person in the cell and then they can join it without having to leave. As it stands at the minute, we'd have to move people into the room, which obviously for a superintendent's extension, not a problem, but if you're doing it for inspector reviews, we would grind to a halt if we're not careful, having to move people out every time. The default position is still to do face-to-face where we can, and absolutely the superintendents and inspectors would expect that, but it's just another option in the toolbox, and actually if it means it can be dealt with quicker and more efficiently, then so be it.
Okay, so two more. If you use Teams for witness statements, would this remove the need to have a digital signature of the statement?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid, and I wouldn't want to say yay or nay. It's not my forte. There'd have to be considerations about how it was done, but I'm sure it's feasible. I'm sure it could be introduced, because it would be benefit for the victim, for the witness as well. You know, plenty of witnesses don't want to come to a police station. They don't want a police officer to come to their house. It could. I'm sure there's ways and means it could be dealt with.
Okay, lovely. And then the final one is back to the custody staff, and how do they feel, whether it's made their job harder or easier?
Well, I've spoken to a custody staff just before we came on board. It's made their job a lot easier, you know. So if less people coming in, solicitors, we have a very good relationship with our solicitors in North Yorkshire, but there's somebody else to manage in the custody suite. It's somebody else to keep an eye on for their safety, and making sure that you only have limited amount of consultation rooms. Actually, if they're not there and they can join and they can join remotely and it can speed things up, then it's got to be better.
Absolutely. Richard, thank you very much. We've just come to the half hour now. There's absolutely loads of information that you've packed into that. So we're really grateful that you've taken the time to share that with us and with our colleagues around the country. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody who has joined us today.